I give the floor to the aide of the UN Secretary General on Human Rights, Mr. Ivan Šimonović.
Pleasure for me to launch the 8th monthly report of the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. The day of my arrival in Ukraine, 11th December, was the first day since hostilities began in the east some 8 months ago that no killings were reported. This result has been repeated on 13th of December. Although there has been some fighting resumed, it is nonetheless encouraging. It is the time to end the bloodshed in Ukraine. As of 12 December, the total number of casualties has reached at least 4,707 killed. Goodwill on all sides will be required for the current ceasefire to be strictly observed and for the return to the negotiating table. In this regard, I welcome the recent instruction of the Ministry of Defense for the armed forces to halt all active hostilities. During discussions with key interlocutors, governmental as well as with the armed groups, I emphasize that it is still not too late to find a way out of this conflict. I am convinced that the Minsk agreement, if comprehensively implemented, remains a good starting point in this regard. I have discussed it with Ambassadors Apakan and Tagliani, and I'm pleased that OSCE will continue to play an important role in this regard. Let me share with you some reflections on the human rights situation. They are based on the findings of the 8th monthly report and on my findings from the last few days in the country. During those days, I met with a wide range of government officials, military and civil society, and visited Mariupol. The human rights in the eastern Ukraine remains grim. The violence and fighting, including indiscriminate attacks, have taken a heavy toll on the local population. This situation is aggravated by the inflow of heavy and sophisticated weaponry as well as foreign fighters, including some from the Russian Federation. The breakdown of law and order and the brutal tactics of armed groups has for past 8 months been responsible for the serious deterioration of all fundamental human rights, including security, liberty and well-being of individuals living in the areas under their control. The population of the East is increasingly desperate and willing to abandon their homes, uproot their families, and leave their businesses behind to seek survival elsewhere. The dire situation, especially in the areas under control of the armed groups, is affecting the whole population, regardless of their nationalities or political affiliation. The current number of registered IDPs as of 12 December is 542,080, and another 567,1956 have crossed the border to other states, in particular to the Russian Federation, and of those 240,095 have applied for refugee status. The situation may further aggravate as a consequence of the government's decision that by 1st December all states, institutions and enterprises in the territory controlled by the armed groups would be relocated and banking services suspended. Over the last days, my civil society interlocutors expressed strong concerns about potential adverse effects of these measures on the population in the East. While it is understandable that the government is concerned about the frequent robberies in the areas controlled by the armed groups and does not wish to fall prey to organized crime, nor fund creation of parallel state structures, such measures may have far-reaching negative humanitarian consequences. Effectively, people such as those entitled to state pensions are being forced to relocate in order to receive them. The same applies to state employees, including those who are providing essential public services. There may be no one to care for those who remain, either unable or unwilling to leave. I am particularly worried about the fate of those in retirement homes, in clinics and hospitals, orphanages and prisons, who may remain without any of the necessary services and medical supplies. During the winter, the hardship of the population in the East will further worsen. I would like to draw your attention to the national launch of the Strategic Response Plan on 17 December that will outline a broad scope of challenges and humanitarian needs. There will be an urgent need for international support, especially for internally displaced persons, regardless of their ethnicity, political affiliation, or region they are from. Ladies and gentlemen, when discussing ways to improve human rights in Ukraine, due attention should be devoted to accountability. Accountability for human rights violations, past and present, is not only crucial for prevention of further human rights violations, it is also essential for the creation of an enabling environment for peace. In this context, it is important not to lose sight of the need to ensure accountability for human rights violations committed in the context of Maidan protests and the 2nd of May Odessa violence. Progress in accountability in these cases has been slow. These investigations should be prioritized and handled swiftly and impartially, as they are crucial for the credibility of the justice system. With regard to the investigations into violations of international humanitarian law, so far very limited progress has been reported in the investigation into more than 300 cases of indiscriminate shelling of residential area since the start of this year. On the other hand, the government has made some progress in ensuring oversight over the volunteer battalions who have in some instances been allegedly involved in serious human rights violations, including torture, ill treatment and arbitrary detentions. In Mariupol, I had the chance to raise with the general in charge of all military and police operations in this area the issue of command responsibility for preventing, investigating and punishing violations of human rights, as well as international humanitarian law. I was pleased to learn that instruction from the Ministry of Defense to ensure respect for Ukraine's obligations under international humanitarian law had reached field commanders. I also raised the issue of command responsibility under international criminal law with representatives of the armed groups. I strongly encourage the Ukrainian government to ratify the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court as soon as possible. This will serve as deterrent for further human rights violations and help pave the way for proper accountability for violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. The human rights situation in Crimea remains of concerns. Representatives of civil society based in Crimea, with whom I spoke, express their alarm over enforced disappearances, the lack of accountability for violations committed by so-called self-defense forces, and restrictions on freedom of expression, assembly, and association. While some parts of society have benefited from salary increases, in particular government sector employees and pensions receivers, these have to a large extent been offset by the overall rise in prices. The severing of ties with Ukraine has led to negative effects on small businesses and the supply of goods. In parallel to addressing the enormous challenges in the East, the government has taken a number of concrete steps to fight corruption, an issue that was one of the root causes of the Maidan protests 1 year ago. A National Council on Anti-Corruption Policy, involving a majority of civil society representatives, was established to coordinate anti-corruption policy and monitor its implementation, and a specialized National Anti-Corruption Bureau will investigate crimes committed by high-level public officials, including judges and prosecutors. At the same time, newly adopted legislation and its implementation raises some human rights concerns. The dismissal of public officials under the lustration law adopted in October has started, and while welcoming the government's initiative to tackle corruption and past abuses, I have also raised with the Ministry of Justice my concerns about the potentially discriminatory arbitrary provisions of this law. In this regard, I welcome the government's decision to cooperate with the Venice Commission of the Council of Europe regarding this law. Another encouraging activity is the preparation of a 5-year human rights strategy to be submitted to the Cabinet of Ministers by January 1st, 2015. I had the opportunity to discuss our support to this process with both Ministries of Justice and Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I welcome the consultative process involving civil society and the Ombudsperson's Office, supported by the Human Rights Mission and the Council of Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, as 2014 draws to a close, Ukraine stands at a crossroads. At this juncture, one path leads to full and large-scale conflict, and the other path to a protracted, frozen conflict. But there is also a third path, the one leading to durable peace in the East and reconciliation. It is my sincere hope that this will be the path chosen by those who hold the power to decide on the fate of this country. It will require concerted efforts among all national and international stakeholders to reach consensus. The Secretary General of the United Nations will continue to support international efforts that may lead to a peaceful solution. The UN Human Rights Mission, for its part, will remain closely engaged with the government and the people of Ukraine in support of this important objective. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention and best wishes to Ukraine and all Ukrainians for 2015, peace, economic recovery, and human rights. I stand ready for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Šimonović. Here's your headphones with translation.
Let me put it on before receiving questions.
Interfax Ukraine, Igor Solovey.
Interfax Ukraine, Igor Solovey. Could you tell us, is there a possibility to consider the responsibility for crimes against humanity of the people who are responsible for the unleashing of war in the east of Ukraine and of those people who are now hiding in the territory of the Russian Federation?
Legislation of Ukraine has been amended to include possibility of trials in absentia, meaning that there is a possibility to launch criminal proceedings against people who are outside of the country. So this could be some legal grounds to launch proceedings against people that are out of country. How the justice system of Ukraine will use this possibility remains to be seen.
Так, дякую.
Новини України. Just 3 details, please. First, about 542 IDPs, 542,000 IDPs. You said that because social payments were stopped and state enterprises are being relocated, how do you think that this run contrary to human rights, the stoppage of social payments? Does it contradict human rights? And you said that because of this, people are urged to leave those territories, so I would like to hear your comment on this. And another point, 300 of indiscriminate shelling of residential blocks. Do you have any information on investigation of this? Because you said that you talked to government officials about this. Have they reached any success in these investigations? Do you have any information on this? And you also mentioned the law on lustration, that it potentially may lead to human rights violations. Can you quote specific articles of the law that should be changed so that we avoid such possible violations?
Let me start with lustration. We think that it is good that there is an attempt to ensure accountability for cases of corruption and abuses in the past. However, some specific provisions of the current law make us concerned about its application. What are those provisions that make us concerned? It is first the time limits of the law, focusing just on one particular period, and which could be interpreted as singling out that particular period with potential consequences of targeting specific cases. A more general and universal approach would be preferred. Something else that is a matter of our concern is the approach which is applicable to broad categories without the opportunity for the ones who are targeted to have their opportunity to say something in their defense, to have their cases be individually heard. I am, on the other hand, very glad that government is now working together with the Venice Commission, or Commission for Democracy Through Law of the Council of Europe, and I believe that these concerns will be raised by the Venice Commission, and that there will be benefit of having illustration without incurring any human rights violation. There were about 300 cases recorded of indiscriminate shellings. It is a fact that neither armed groups nor government has taken responsibility for any of those indiscriminate attacks. In this situation, to prevent future indiscriminate attacks, it is essential to have investigation to establish whose responsibility it is, and if there are grounds for taking legal actions, such a legal action should be taken. So far, this has not been the case, and I firmly believe that those investigations and, if necessary, continued legal proceedings should be prioritized. And now to the issue of requesting people who are retired to have residence outside of the area controlled by the armed groups to receive their entitlements. I think that these provisions of the governmental measures are quite concerning. It is understandable that after a series of armed robberies of the money that was coming into areas controlled by armed groups, the government wanted to prevent scarce resources from being plundered. It is also understandable that government is reluctant to have resources used for building of parallel state structures in the armed groups controlled areas. However, making pensions inaccessible to a number of people or forcing them to relocate represent a serious problem. But I'm very happy that President recent statement has indicated a concern of government for their own citizens living in the area under controlled armed groups, expressing concerns for their humanitarian needs. I therefore hope that this concern will be successfully met with new appropriate government's either interpretation of these measures or their further elaboration to prevent them from hurting civilians that may be subject to its application.
Максим Івануха, Національний ЛГБТ-портал. У мене таке запитання до вас. Останнім часом почастішали випадки дискримінації.
And please slower so that I get
Національний
translation.
Lately, the cases became more frequent. Lately, the cases became more frequent of discrimination of people on the grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity. Do you pay attention to the fact that in the elaboration, in the drawing of the national strategy being drawn now by state bodies and human rights groups, that they omit the discrimination of LGBT and to the fact that the aggression against this community, LGBT community, has risen in recent months in Ukraine. So what's your reaction to this?
United Nations have a very clear position on the issue of sexual orientation and gender identity, treating it as a form of discrimination, and any sort of discrimination is against human rights law. Therefore, it is definitely something that United Nations will be advising while strategy and action plan is being prepared. But it must be clear that both strategy and action plan have national ownership. To the extent that we can, we will make our views on this issue very clear.
Олена Мацюцька, ТСН 1.
1+1 television channel. You mentioned our volunteer battalions and possible human rights violation on their side. Is it some fresh information or is it your general impression and you are quoting someone? In your UN report, is there a specific information on the violation of human rights on the side, on the part of illegal armed forces, about militants who are in the east of Ukraine? Because you only spoke about the government, but do the militants violate human rights?
Got just partial translation of your questions, and I will answer the issues that I have heard. But please ask additional questions if I don't fully answer your question. It is our position that human rights violations or violations of international law should be acted upon no matter who is their perpetrator. Our monitoring mission has received some information on violations that were committed by some members of voluntary battalions. We have reported in our monthly mission report on our concerns about these violations. But I can also express that we are very satisfied that now volunteer battalions are included in the hierarchy of command of the Ministry of Interior and Ministry of Defense. This is a welcome measure that will hopefully lead to better discipline and to ensure that action will be taken if those violations occur. It must be clear that command responsibility concept applies responsibility of civil and military leaders, not only for orders that they give, but also for preventing violations and for investigating and, if necessary, punishing perpetrators if those violations occur. I believe, and this part I haven't fully understood, that you also raised the issue of violations committed by the armed groups.
The second part of my question was about
Yeah, it was about illegal armed groups in the east of Ukraine, or terrorists as they are called here. Human rights violations of perpetrated by those people, are they included?
In fact, if I would speak about quantity of crimes, and quantity of other violations of international humanitarian and human rights law. Majority of them have been committed by representatives of armed groups. We have regularly reported on those violations, and it's a long list of them. Although at the moment those persons are not within reach of Ukrainian authorities, it is important to collect evidence, and these cases should continue, and there must be accountability when situation will permit. I must make it clear that the law that has been now recalled on amnesty was also in line with human rights standards, because it provided for the accountability for crimes against humanity and war crimes, and that amnesty applied only to minor violations. This is in line with international humanitarian law.
Доброго дня.
Could you please comment on the situation that pertains to the yesterday's halting of the Dnipro 1 battalion when they stopped the humanitarian convoy that was yesterday moving into the territory controlled by the armed groupings, and the statements that Hello?
Not aware of particular case that you are referring to, but I can tell you that I arrived from Mariupol yesterday, and that I met there with commander in charge of operations. And knowing that United Nations are returning to Donetsk, we as Human Rights Office were there all the time, but now some humanitarians are returning to Donetsk, and there would be more humanitarian assistance coming from Mariupol. So I was in touch with General Popkov, who is in charge of that area. And he has assured me that he will do everything to ensure that there is unimpeded humanitarian access to areas under control of armed groups. Furthermore, I was also in contact with representatives of armed groups, also asking for assurances that there would be no interruptions of access of humanitarian assistance, and that United Nations will be able also to distribute humanitarian aid that comes under areas under their control. I got assurances in this regard as well. And I can also say, although I do not know about a particular case and details, that preventing access of humanitarian aid in some cases could be considered as a violation of international humanitarian law.
Каневская News, Наталья Каневская.
Could you tell us, please, in 2016 there will be the 75th anniversary of the tragedy of Babin Yar that took place here in Ukraine, and on the 27th of January of 2015 there will be a similar event of Holocaust which will be marked probably on the territory of Poland. How does your organization take part in this? And for many people in Ukraine, this is a very important issue, and there are new representatives of civil society who would like to have a constant and immediate contact with your organization regarding this issue, including the preparation for the events that are going to take place in 2016. So, you know, the time is ticking off.
Much for this not only question, but also for the opportunity to say that we are absolutely interested to get involved in these issues. And here with me today is Armen Harutyunyan, head of United Nations Human Rights Mission in Ukraine, and he stands ready to discuss the issue and to liaise with the headquarters of the United Nations in Geneva in New York to take part and support these important commemorations. And when speaking about 2016, let us hope that we will be more remembering past tragedies than discussing current human rights challenges, hoping that by that time they will be overcome.
Олена Мацюцька, 1+1.
I still have the same question about the militants, about illegal groups on the territory of the East, and about people whom we call terrorists. Who in the east of Ukraine is more responsible for the violation of human rights of the people who live there? Is it the Ukrainian government or the militants? 500 people, whom are they fleeing in Ukraine? Whose acts are they fleeing? Who are responsible for pushing them out? Whose troops these are? What does your report say?
In our reports that we are describing the lawlessness and human rights violations that are taking part in armed group controlled areas. We describe in details a list of violations that are taking place there, including summary executions, arbitrary killings, enforced disappearances, arbitrary arrest, torture, to name just some of them. It is quite clear that people are fleeing from these areas, no matter of their nationality and political orientation, because some of them are becoming internally displaced in the areas that are under governmental control. But some are also fleeing away into other countries, including to the Russian Federation. It is, of course, a matter of utmost control. If we would have to quantify, based on our monitoring, violations, a majority of violations have been committed by armed groups in the areas under their control. However, human rights violations by one side do not justify any other human rights violations as a kind of retaliation. Therefore, government has also do its due diligence to prevent and to punish violations that have also been recorded on its own side.
Максим Івануха, національний ЛГБТ-портал. У мене ще одна.
Again, LGBT portal. Another question to you. Which kind of support the LGBT community of Ukraine can have from the UN, as LGBT are not protected by the Ukrainian government, and can we count on any support from you?
Definitely. We can inform. We can do that publicly. I can do it from here. We can do it from Geneva and New York in making United Nations views clear that violation of rights of all persons, including LGBT, is violation of human rights. And I can tell you that on 10th of December, the day of the International Human Rights Day, the day when the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights has been adopted. In United Nations, in New York, we have had an LGBT event attended by Deputy Secretary General in the absence of Secretary General, which was dedicated to the importance that families accept differences within their families and have same warm relations with their LGBT members as with anyone else. These are the values that United Nations stand for, and we will promote these values. Of course, it is on Ukraine to adopt its own laws and policies, but this is what the United Nations stand for.
Колеги, чи є ще запитання? Якщо запитань немає, thank you, Mr. Шимонович.
There are no questions. Thank you, Mr. Šimonović.
It's to Ukraine.
Thank you. Колеги, наша робота сьогодні завершена.